know that you have been working with multicultural groups a lot. Can you say a few words about that?
Yes. The early professional shows I did, and did plays and books for, were really on the whole about the indigenous white Londoners. But I'm now a Londoner myself and have been for 40-odd years. And it seemed crazy not to take the opportunity of hearing, recording, and reflecting the stories of older people from minorities, which could be played back to other people from those minorities on the same principle as the reminiscence theatre we'd done up to that point, but which could also play to a wider audience and open people's minds and hearts to the experience of being an immigrant to Great Britain in our case. As you know, London, I think every language in the world is spoken in London, and it's a wonderfully vibrant, multicultural city where I personally was absolutely wedded to the idea of multiculturalism and valuing one another's cultures, and keeping their observances, keeping their separateness, but sharing their perceptions and their stories. Understanding through stories is so important in that area. Life story work, but with minorities. There were some differences. For example, the women and the men chose to be interviewed separately. There were language issues, because although we might be working, say, with Indian immigrants, there were maybe 5 or 6 common languages: Punjabi, Gujarati, Bengali, and so we developed a kind of theatre that was in 2 languages simultaneously, bilingual productions. And in those, all the emotions and all the facts were covered in English and in Punjabi, with some Hindi and so on. And the songs were sung in Indian style and Indian words. I should say that all the productions, whether they were with minorities or not, involved professional standard musicians, because we felt early on that music was a wonderful trigger. It also afforded a kind of pause in a play for people watching it to gather themselves, to have their own memories of the music, and then to come back refreshed to the next scene. It wasn't always easy to gather stories in minority groups. We worked with many such groups, but a lot were English-speaking. For example, the Jewish community, the Irish community. There were so many Irish people came over from large families in Ireland where there wasn't enough to feed everybody, and a lot of the young people were shipped over to England to find work, which they did, important work in hospitals, in transport, in building work, in hotel work. And it was good to record those stories. And then we had, for example, there, the great pleasure of coming back to Ireland and performing the stories of the people who left to the people who stayed in Ireland. And that was a very fascinating project. Similarly with the Jewish project, we interviewed people and then took their stories to synagogues and to Jewish groups and non-Jewish groups in Europe as well as in the UK. But there were challenges in working with ethnic minorities, challenges of language particularly, and culture. But we, I think, dealt with that by, as in many of our professional productions, bringing the contributors into the rehearsal process. And every time the performers of whatever production, every time they went into some kind of setting which was like the places they would probably ultimately perform in, there was a strong sense on the part of the contributors that yes, we're being consulted, we're important in this. These actors of very high standard are taking our stories out across the world. So there was quite a strong sense of pride on the part of the people being talked to. One other point about multicultural work is that the school children in London particularly, but in other parts of the country as well, contain children from every part of the world. The schools are extremely multicultural, and it's been very nice to take the plays, whether they're performed by professionals or even some of the plays by older ethnic minority elders, into the schools. And then the children from those minorities feel they have role models, they have a sense of history, they have a sense of why they're there in a white London classroom, from the stories told by the older people, whether through theatre by professionals or whether the production is performed by older people. I mean, I suppose I've talked more about professional side of the work, where the actors will have maybe 4 weeks to create a new piece and to learn the music parts and have the costumes and all the props. You know, it's a big, like any other theatre production, with a cast of 4 or 5. But also, the older people, increasingly, in my experience, have been willing to perform their own memories. Now that's difficult to achieve, but it's very rewarding. I'd say it's probably the most rewarding work I've done, in a way, which is seeing older people become performers themselves at a time when they would never have thought that they could learn a script. But of course, in some ways they're not learning a script because it's their stories and they can remember the progress of the story. But that was a very exciting area, especially, I mean, the more people said, no, please don't ask me to do this, I can't do it. And the more they saw that they could, it was risk-taking of the healthiest possible kind, I thought.
Is that what you call the good companion?
Yes.
Yeah?
This was a group who, they were just volunteers in the centre, my Reminiscence Centre, which was a little museum and community centre and training room. They said, please, please, Pam, let us just make the sandwiches. But I'd invited some colleagues from Germany to come and work on Reminiscence Theatre with them. And I said, well, look, this is very embarrassing. If none of you come, please come, just for the first day. And they said, oh, okay. And they had a great time. And then my friends from Germany stayed for 2 weeks and we made the basics of the play, then polished it up, and then took it to Germany. And for many of those old people, that was the first time they'd flown. And it was the first time they'd had a passport. In fact, one old lady was having her passport photograph taken and her granddaughter was sitting outside. And another lady asked the little girl, well, is that your granny in there? Is she trying to get a picture for her bus pass so she can travel for free? And the little girl said, no, no, my granny's an actress. She's getting her passport.
Another area is the intergenerational aspect or experience. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I've talked a bit about work in classrooms, where the older people go into the classroom and tell their stories, perform their stories, and then involve the children in enactments. For example, I'm thinking of an African group who conveyed to the children their sense of an African village with elders and where children were given tasks and what life was like. And then the children enacted these memories, cutting crops in the fields, doing domestic tasks, sweeping with brooms, we put this play on for local people at an ethnic minority festival. And it was beautiful, with the old people and the children singing African songs together. But another kind of reminiscence theatre of an intergenerational type is the youth theatre work that we've done, you know, that you bring together a group of children, maybe a youth theatre group, or maybe set up a small local group specially, and they work together with the older people, and the old people direct their scenes, tell their stories, direct their scenes, and then they perform together. And the group I set up, the Good Companions, they didn't just do that first show, which they were so reluctant about. They then worked together with me for 12 years. And every year we produced a new show. And interestingly, their memories and their capacity to learn lines and so on, instead of decreasing, improved. And they were very heavily involved and quite well, not nearly as dependent as they had been on their sons and daughters and grandchildren. And one other very important aspect there, I know I'm jumping about a bit here, but a very important aspect of older people making theatre, whether it's with children or not, is that there's the possibility there for really quite deep friendships, that older people are sharing important aspects of their lives with one another, as well as with young people. And so their mutual understanding is based on a knowledge of one another's past. And that was true of the Good Companions, this older people's theatre group, which grew out of the one-day experiment, which they were so reluctant to conduct. But participants went on holidays together and met regularly and were firm friends at a time in life, in their late 70s, early 80s, when, you know, you're often really short of friends. You've lost contact with old friends for one reason or another, through bereavement or whatever. And so the social aspects are phenomenally important.
So Pam, could you tell us a bit about your experience of using reminiscence theatre together with people with dementia?
Yes. Back in 1997, the European Reminiscence Network, which I lead and which is usually about 12 countries strong, European countries, was looking into the possibilities of dementia and reminiscence being an effective mix. How could reminiscence help people with dementia? It sounds strange to talk to people who are losing so much of their memories about their past and to be exercising their memories. But there's a fairly broad understanding that the distant past is quite easy to recall, and that with sensory stimuli of various kinds, other memories of more recent years also can be retrieved. It depends on the stimulus. And my European partners and I agreed to approach the European Union for a pilot study, which would look at involving families living with dementia, which actually is more common than people living in care homes, really. How could we support and stimulate those families in such a way that they would be willing and able to go on caring at home for longer? We found that one of the most effective ways of stimulating memories was through the arts of various kinds, drawing people's memories, singing songs connected with the past, dancing the dances of the past, and reenacting the past. We found that people who couldn't bring to mind large chunks of their lives, when stimulated by other people's memories and by enactment, physical reenactments of some related story, would open and trigger their own minds. So we were getting a very strong response when we used theatre. By theatre, I mean bringing to life a little story or a set of stories through a process of improvisation. I think I said that the professional theatre work was all based on verbatim use of reminiscence interviews, oral history interviews, however you like to call them. But in the case of working with dementia, that wasn't the key element. The key element was to activate, to enable people to get up and to join in and to commit themselves to an enactment, which even if it wasn't their story, the situation would be familiar. They would know how to participate successfully. So people, for example, who couldn't, as I was saying, recall large chunks of their lives, when they were brought to life in a session which included artists and actors, and which included the older people themselves and their family carers, we had some wonderful spontaneous scenes. You were asking me about the idea of the wedding as a topic for enacting. And this is really important for several reasons. Firstly, it's often a time to recall a very positive time in a relationship, which may now be under great strain. And it can be very significant to validate that relationship, the central one in the caring connection. Another reason is that if you hold a wedding party, most people have been to a wedding, they know the atmosphere at a wedding, they can participate. They can take a very small role as the mother of the bride, or as a bridesmaid, or a villain, or whoever is coming to the wedding. And you can make a whole group scene. And because that group scene is about a celebration, you can include celebratory drinks and refreshments. And it works in such a way that people feel they've really been to a wedding and had a wonderful time. And I've led this project maybe 100 times now over the last 20 years. And it's very exciting to see a whole group participating, no matter what their condition. I mean, the last wedding in our dementia project that I attended, the groom was a gentleman who'd had a stroke and had dementia and was very difficult to understand. And his wife was a very exhausted artist who was looking after him beautifully, but very demanding man. But they agreed to be the bride and groom at the wedding. And this man's pride and his ability to say, I do, and yes, to take this person for my wedded wife, and her ability, the wife's ability, to say yes, and to love, and to honor, and to obey, etc. And, this was a very tricky group of people with many different needs, many different languages, many different cultures. But, I played one of the priests, but we also had an Iranian person with dementia who played the imam. And so, there was a role for everybody, even if it was just saying a couple of words. For example, we might say, who has some advice for this happy young couple who are getting married? So the old people who are getting married listen to the advice of the others, and so on.